This is an overview of Dessa's side of the family. So that is her father's side, who are the Gampels, and her mother's side, who are the Passensteins. Mostly it's going to be about the Passensteins. And let's start with the one thing that the Passensteins have in common with Harry's side, the Rabinowitzes, and that is that they too have a famous Hasidic ancestor. So in the Passenstein case, they are descendants of Schmelke of Nikolsburg. As you can see here, it's carved into the headstone, this headstone from 1873, which belongs to Yehoshua Heschel Passenstein. There's a few things to notice here. One is that Schmelke's last name is Horowitz, not Passenstein. And a second is that Nikolsburg is actually pretty far away from Warsaw, where the Passensteins are. One more thing is that the family seems to lose Schmelke after a while. So Yehoshua Heschel has sons who are also buried in the same Warsaw cemetery, and they don't talk about Schmelke at all. And I think that Schmelke represents where they came from, how they got there, and then really what they left behind to create something new, a new way of life in Warsaw. The earliest Passensteins I can find are Mordecai and Laha, which I think is Leah, who are the parents of Yehoshua. Now you notice that Mordecai was born around 1795, which is about 20 or so years after Schmelke died. My best guess is that Mordecai was either the first or second generation of his family to live in Warsaw, so he would have left wherever Schmelke was at that time, maybe being a grandson or a great-grandson. And being from such an elite family, Mordecai was probably educated and with some connections to the elite among Jewish families. Now, at the time that we're talking about, around 1800, the elite Jews had two paths. One was the religious and scholarly path, of the kind of thing that Schmelke did, and the other was to be part of the merchant class who worked for the non-Jewish noblemen. And I'm pretty sure that Mordecai and then his sons took the second path. So simply put, the noblemen, they owned pretty much everything. They owned the land, they owned the rivers, they owned the woods. They had the rights to all of that, but they didn't necessarily want to run those things. They didn't have the trade networks. They didn't have the banking background. They didn't have the interest or the time to run those things. So they would appoint or grant rights to a Jew, so that the Jew would run those things and either pay them outright something or give them parts of the profits. But because they were Jewish and they didn't have full rights, it wasn't too hard for a nobleman to claw that back if they didn't trust the person anymore. So this is how a lot of Jews actually did become wealthy and powerful, at least for a while. And the relevant court Jew in Warsaw is this man. So I'm really not sure how to pronounce this guy's name, so I'm just going to call him by his first name, Shmuel. But he is the court Jew of this kind right around Warsaw. And you can see like this huge range of things he's doing. He's shipping grain and wood down the river to Gdansk, so pretty far away. He's trading cattle, horses, pigs, hides. He's also running inns, butcheries, distilleries, breweries. He owns a sawmill. He owns brick factories. He has weaving workshops. But interestingly, he doesn't actually live in Warsaw itself. He lives across the river in a suburb called Praga, where he founded a settlement for Jews. Many of his, I think most of his workers were Jews. And at the time, even though he's running all of this, as a Jew, he's not actually allowed to live in Warsaw. There are a few Jews who live there. They have a special right, but it's very unusual. So Praga is the place where these Shmuel's Jews live, and that is where our Mordecai and Laha Passensteins also live. So that, I think, pretty much explains how and why Mordecai ended up in Warsaw. I mean, it's basically Warsaw. And the next question is, where does the name Passenstein come from? And it seems pretty likely that it was just made up. That, according to this history, there was a period from 1795 to 1806 where the Jewish community of Warsaw, that includes this Praga part, was just under the control of the Prussian administrator, who handed out surnames according to his fancy. And that's what it says. The lucky ones came away with Applebaum, which would be like apple tree, and Himmelfarb, which would be like sky color. And Passenstein, as far as I can tell, means something like fitting stone. It's not a bad name, but it is a very rare name. It doesn't show up almost anywhere. So I think it was just made up in a particular moment for some reason. The last issue is that by the time Mordecai and Leah are having children, starting around 1820 or so, the whole system that I've just talked about is coming undone. The Polish nobility, they have less and less power as the years go by. The laws and the economy are modernizing, and Jews don't really have to live like this anymore. So by the 1850s, it is totally illegal for Jews to live in Warsaw itself, for them to own property and to run businesses. That doesn't mean everything's nice, but it's all legal, and they don't have to go through a nobleman anymore. So by this point, it seems to me the Passensteins have sort of split into a Praga branch and a Warsaw branch. So the Praga branch, and somewhere along the line, the spelling of the name might have changed. So we have some Passteins, mostly who stay in Praga, and then Passensteins, who move into Warsaw. But whether you're a Passenstein or a Passtein in Warsaw or Praga, what's interesting about this whole family is they are all trading. They're being merchants. They're doing the kinds of things that they used to do for nobles, but now they're doing it for themselves. So here's a quick run through of this family and their businesses. First, Laha was selling greens in 1854. Second is Shmuel, her son, who was born in 1818. He grew up to be a miller with a two-bladed windmill on a piece of property that had once belonged to our Shmuel's Zabi Tower. And by 1870, our Shmuel had developed his property into a colony, meaning some kind of small settlement in the Praga district, and he still had his windmill. Several years later, the Konoser vodka factory was built there. So I assume he, Shmuel, or his heirs sold the property. Next, here's Bendit, who lived a very long time, to the age of 81. Like his brother Shmuel, Bendit was an entrepreneur, but he got into buying and selling iron products and military equipment. By 1870, he had already moved into Warsaw itself, which had gotten much easier for Jews to do over the course of the century. Next, we have Hirsch, who is our direct ancestor. In 1854, he was listed as a factor in the Warsaw Directory, which means he was still working for a nobleman or a large landowner of some sort. But 2 years later, in 1856, he had started trading oil, meaning like a vegetable oil or olive oil. And I assume this business was still going when Hirsch died in 1873. Of Hirsch's three sons, Zachary seems to have been the biggest businessman, owning property in a nearby village, as well as following his uncle Bendit into the iron products and military supplies business. Zachary's older brother Mordecai shows up in the 1909 Warsaw Business Directory under the category of colonial goods stores. And the best I can figure is that his store served the household needs of the people who were moving into all these newly developed settlements of a quickly growing city. So the kind of thing that Shmuel had created in Praga. And then the youngest of these three brothers is Isaac, and he is our direct ancestor. He is Des's grandfather. Isaac shows up in the Warsaw Directory as a clerk, while his brother Benjamin is listed as a merchant. So I wonder if Isaac worked for his merchant brother. Two of the sisters, Ita and Sima, married two brothers, Asher and Benjamin Gamble. Asher, we know, was a property owner, and Benjamin was an industrialist, which means he owned a factory of some sort. In the next generation, Mordecai's son, Shia Hurst, was a real go-getter. And he started with a savings and loan in 1913. He had a bakery in 1920. He also was an oil trader. He had a shoe factory in the 20s and a dairy products business called Sanitas in the 30s. One interesting and weird side note here is that I think the B. Gamble, who was also part of Shia's bank management, is Benjamin Gamble, who was married to Shia's Aunt Ita. And this is the same Benjamin Gamble who, after his wife's death, got remarried to Justina, his dead wife's niece, which makes him also our direct ancestor because he is Dessa's father. And then finally, in the last generation, we have Shia's eldest son, Marek, who was a banker in 1936. Isaac's eldest, Mordecai, who got into the vinegar trade. And maybe most impressive of all, Isaac's youngest son, Lou, who ran away to America at a young age and made a fortune with Helene Curtis. So in the 1930s, Lou was very rich enough to get seven of his family members to the United States. Actually, there's a little more to the story of how Justine got to the U.S., so I'm making a short additional video about that, which is about Justine and an organization called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society.